for a lot of years, sometimes it's easy to figure out what the focus is of the scripture and how I want to preach it. I try not to repeat anything, meaning I don't have a printed text and I don't put it into a file cabinet and 3 years later go to the file cabinet and pulled out the sermon that I preached 3 years ago, because you won't remember that anyway. I don't do that. In fact, I remember the sermon teachers that I had, preaching teachers, that he always insisted on a printed text. And while there are times that you probably wondered, where the heck is he going with this? If you had a printed text, you would get it, right? You could follow, I could follow along and not get lost in what I wanted to say. But in any event, I remember the particular Sunday where I gave all the wonderful theology and all the biblical scholarship and then said, so what? And stepped out of the pulpit and came down in front of the congregation and said, so what? So what do we do with this? That was the last time that I ever used a printed text. And the last time I ever, not quite ever, but the last time that I felt compelled to stand in the pulpit and preach, because it just made more sense to preach on the same level as the congregation. But in any event, there are times like this Sunday for this particular parable where it's just very difficult, for me anyway, to figure out what it's about. So I have resources, and I'm not trying to impress you at all, but I just want you to know that sometimes what I say, sometimes, not all the time, of what I say is grounded in good biblical scholarship and in the people who have spent more of their scholarship and their time reflecting on this. So I went to my bookshelf, and this is a book called The Parables of Jesus by a fellow named Joachim Jeremias. And Jeremias was one of the very first scholars, almost over 100 years ago probably now, who really did a serious study of the parables in their context, meaning he didn't just start with the Bible and try to figure it out, that he went back into the culture and the history and the life of the people and tried to look at the parables as they would have been looked at in that time period, right? So he is like the foundation scholar that everybody starts with. Another scholar that came along quite a bit later with a different version and different view is a fellow by the name of John Dominic Crossan, and some of you may know, you've done some reading on him before, but in parables. So he furthers the scholarship of Jeremias, but really spends some time looking at that, the dynamics of the language and how it might have been heard in that time, and then how it can be understood for us today. And there's a whole lot more people in between. And then I just pulled this off. It took me a whole day to find this book because I'd stuck it on my bookshelf and didn't remember where I exactly put it. But of course, just a few months ago, here at Chalice, we were reading this book by Amy Jill Levine, who she's Jewish, and so it was a really interesting read to hear how a Jewish scholar would look at the parables of Jesus. He was a Jew. Well, that just makes sense, right? A Jew understanding a Jew and how it was. And she also takes a different view. But the definitive text that most, especially Crossan and Amy Jill Levine and anybody doing parable research today, is this handy-dandy little book. It says, The Parables of Jesus, Red Letter Edition. Now, some of you may have grown up with Bibles that had red letters in them, meaning that this was the actual words of Jesus, and so the Bible used the red, right, which we've discovered now thanks to this work. And this was put on by the Jesus Seminar, and in fundamentalist and conservative circles, all you need to do is have mention Jesus Seminar, and they go, they just freak out. They just go berserk. I remember having an argument with the bishop, Catholic bishop, over this because something came out about the red letter edition, and he just freaked out about it, and I freaked out about him freaking out about it. And anyway, that the scholarship, you can read through this, and it's just fascinating that their attempt was, can we get back to the actual words of Jesus? And they list all the scholars in the back, well over 100 scholars, and they had, the thing that freaks people out is they had little, like ping pong balls, so they had red balls, pink balls, gray balls, and black balls. And so, depending upon, as they sat around and had their conversations and did all their research and everything, then they took a vote. And that was the thing that freaks out conservatives. They took a vote. So each scholar could put into a box the color of ball that they felt was this not at all Jesus' words, or were these indeed Jesus' words. And they came down to very few of the actual parables in the scripture, in the Gospels, are Jesus. More of them are, like we hear today in the second part of this reading, more of what the church says, or what the Christian community or the gospel writer has to say. But I also went to this book, that this is a series of commentaries. It's called Interpretation, a Bible Commentary for Teaching and Preaching. And each of the books of the Bible have a scholar who takes in and goes through and tries to do the technical word exegesis of teaching, and so that's always their focus. But to be honest with you, going through all of this, it was like, I don't know, none of it really moved me, except, and for the life of me, I tried to think of it afterwards when I zeroed in on this, that I tried to remember where in all of this that I read it, and I had no clue. It just stuck in my brain, and I have no clue where it was. And it's the phrase in the text where it says, the question comes, well, how did these weeds get into the midst of this field? Didn't you sow good seed? How did we get these weeds? And the master says, well, it must have been the evil one. And then he goes on, and that stuck in my mind, the evil one. Wow, this, and how the interpretation goes, right? And I'll come back to that in a moment. But, well, it's like this. Now, right, I could do, and Amy Jill Levine talks about it, and Crossan talks about it. It just makes sense. Have you ever seen a field where as they rotate the crops, that, one year they have, crops and the thing grows about this high. The next year when they rotate out the crop is this high. And you can look across the field and you go, well, look at that. How weird. That's not even one of the current crops. That you can see, that a seed from the previous year decided it was going to sprout, and it grows above all the others, right? Just try, planting grass in your yard. Maybe not, we plant rocks, but growing up in the Midwest, you plant grass. And invariably, what happens? Where do those dandelions come from? How did they get, and it's like, I know, that's how I, growing up, that was my first, what do you call it? What is it? Chore. Well, chore, but you get paid for doing the chore, right? And that was my first money that I made, was going out and digging up the dandelion. But the trick was, right, that you had to get the dandelion before it had that little white thing at the top of it, because the little white thing at the top of it were the seeds, and if you didn't catch it before it went to seed, you'd have more dandelions. Of course, for a little kid, that was great, because that was more money for me, right? And there I am out with my little digger digging up the dandelions, and, and I would literally count them and go to my mom or dad and say, I got 20 dandelions today, so give me my quarter for each one, right? In any event, so it's a common kind of experience that, of course, that we can't plant such pure seeds in a field That there isn't going to be from somewhere else weeds come in or deciding that they're going to sprout when you didn't. They didn't have the modern plows that go down the field, and so you didn't. So this kind of is a picture that, okay, we got this. This is a common occurrence, that they're just going to be weeds in the field no matter what. No matter how much you try, right? Of course, now with organic foods and that, too bad if there's weeds in the field. Although I'm convinced that some of the restaurants are serving dandelion greens. Like, what the heck is that? That's the most ridiculous thing that I've ever heard of. They're a weed. Why am I eating that in a vegetarian restaurant, right? And of course, they put a little olive oil and vinaigrette and make you think that it's really good, right? You're eating a weed, for God's sake. But in any event, the phrase, an evil one has done this. And so I got to thinking about it. So that the evil one has done this. And I got to thinking about the voice of the evil one. And I went all the way back to Genesis. And in the third and fourth chapter of Genesis, it tells us that the serpent came to the man and the woman, and the serpent says, "Did God really tell you not to eat of the tree in the middle of the garden?" And the man and the woman go, "Yes, that's what God said." And then the serpent says, "Well, surely that's not, you must have misheard God. Because if you eat of this fruit in the middle of the garden, you will not only have more knowledge or equal knowledge to God, but you will be much happier if you eat this fruit." And so I looked it up in the one translation, and I'm not going to get it exactly right, but the one translation says, the man and the woman looked at the fruit and went, wow, that looks pretty good. That really looks delicious. Wow. And the thought that we might get wisdom in eating this, wow, that is really, really the better choice. So the voice of the evil one convinces the man and the woman, and you know how the rest of the story goes, right? We're still struggling with this. It's just like, we said, it's just like the good angel and the bad angel on your shoulders. The good angel says, now you know what the best moral and ethical choice here to make. Doesn't quite sound that way, but that's how it comes out. The bad angel says, oh, now come on. Don't listen to that good angel over there, because you know that you're going to be much happier, and boy, it's going to be the best choice that you make by doing this bad thing over here. And so the conversation goes. And a lot of times, well, we might choose to listen to the good angel because, we don't want to get in trouble with our parents. We don't want to get in trouble with the teachers at school. We don't want to get in trouble with the pastor. So, but you see, we're making the choice based upon the avoidance of punishment. Where this over here doesn't carry any punishment, it just has pleasure attached to it. Just make these good choices, these choices over here, even though they're going to ultimately be bad for you. But right now, it's just the instant pleasure. So that this evil voice, it's the evil voice that we constantly hear, even today, even more so, right? How many times we hear an evil voice that tries to convince us that something that is bad is actually good. Doesn't that happen? It's like the voices that our Carla and I were just talking about that. It's a voice that says, if we just teach our children that there are benefits to slavery, then we won't think slavery was bad. Well, that just sounds wonderful, doesn't it? I mean, after all, they learn trades. Yeah, right. What trades did a slave learn? How to be a sharecropper, right? And you know this, that after the Civil War, right, that they went out and they tried to be farmers. Well, guess what happened to that? It was an absolute failure. And where did it lead them after that? They become sharecroppers, meaning they didn't even own the land that they were, and most of the crop that they got from it went to the landowner. Wow, that's a real benefit, isn't it? We hear this all the time, Just put your investments in bitcoins and you're going to become wealthy beyond imagination. And, and I don't want to put this too much in the black and white and the good and evil thing, but you see, the evil voice wants to convince us that the choices, well, let's say it this way. I think this is how I hear it. The evil voice baits us. It baits us. It's the evil voice that's baiting us, that the evil really wants war. And so the evil voice says that I'm going to show you how serious I am about going to war, that I'm going to amass X number of thousands of missiles and tanks and bombs, and I'm going to have thousands of soldiers, and I'm going to invade you, and that's going to, because what's the response that is kind of expected response to that? Well, I'm not going to let myself, so I'm going to go to war, and pretty soon, you see how we're being baited into thinking that the choices that we have are so limited that we have to engage in violence and war to get what we want. And where does it really get us? Who's going to pay for the rebuilding of the Ukraine after this? I mean, we're not in the same place we were at the end of World War II, where the Marshall Plan decided that we needed to rebuild, Western Europe. So that the voice entices us, baits us. It baits us into thinking that, power and strength and, brawn and muscles, that this is what's good. And that makes you a better human being to have all of that. It baits us into thinking that, why would you be satisfied with what you got? You always want more, right? So the voice baits us into thinking that we got to have more and more. Bigger house, nicer car, that we got to have, a better job, that we got to have this, that we got to have that. And so the voice, and where does it get us? One of the students that got baited by that voice into thinking that the only way that they could have any kind of advanced career was to put themselves into $400,000 of debt. And now where are they? That voice convinced them that that was a good choice, and now they're suffering because of that. So, now where do we go? Well, here's the interesting thing. So, the master says it's an evil one. The servants say, well, here's the best way to do it. We just go out and we pull up the weeds. That's one response. The master says, whoa, wait a minute. Because if you read the e-Sojourner this week, that, there are two kinds of grain that were growing in that time. One was the bad one and one was the good one. And you didn't really know which one was which until they got to almost harvest time, when the bad one, that the way that the top of the grain, that it lopped over, and then you could tell what it was. Well, by then it's too late, right? Because it might have multiplied to the point where there's less good grain and more bad grain. And so then you see the voice convinces us that the only response to that is just pull the whole cotton picking thing up and burn it all. Get rid of it all. But the response, right, says no. And you see, this is the surprise. Remember last week I talked that in the parable of the sower, the surprise comes at the end of the parable when the farmer doesn't expect to get anything from the planting of the seed. And what happens is that the farmer not only gets enough, he gets more than enough, he gets beyond enough. And at that moment, the surprise that comes has to do with the experience of the reign of God. And the surprise is that when you listen to that other voice that convinces you that there's only one way to respond, one act to make, only one choice that you have, that it convinces us that we don't have any other alternatives to deal with the crisis in the world around us, that it's only by way of violence and only by the way of extreme wealth. And well, you just kind of go on with the argument that the surprise in this parable is that the voice, perhaps Jesus, says, just let it be. What? The usual way of responding, we're surprised by the fact that there might be another way of responding. What? I'm just so used to always choosing anger or violence, or I'm just so used to choosing those things, and now you're telling me, wait? You know, it's interesting that the rest of the parable suggests, well, you know, this is just how it is. You know, they're just, you never know that the person sitting next to you looks good, but might actually be bad. But since we're so welcoming and so inclusive, we just kind of have to take pot shot and hope that, you know, if we just convince all of the bad people here today that they need to be good, that somehow or another maybe they'll change and be good. So that's why we keep welcoming all the bad people. And so you gotta wink, wink. I'm kind of winking about that. Because one of the interpretations that I read, and this, if you've ever heard of Opus Dei, Opus Dei is like this real reactionary, fundamentalist Catholic organization that many people subscribe to. And so it says this, it's just so surprising that you know, the purpose is exactly what I said, that the institutional way of interpreting the parable is to say, you know, just let them come, because we'll speak to their heart, and they'll get so troubled in heart that they'll have a nice altar call, and we'll baptize them right on the spot, and they will have an instantaneous change in their life. Have you ever done a study of Billy Graham's altar calls? Within weeks of people coming forward to, you know, accept Jesus as their personal Lord and Savior, they stopped coming to church. Because it really wasn't a conversion of heart. You know, it's like saying, Tammy and I were talking about, it's like making the suggestion that the institutional response that is expected, that when a community appears to not be sustainable anymore, that the only response that we can make to not being sustainable, where they can't pay their bills and they don't, and they, you know, the scenario, that the only response that can be made to that moment in time is to close down. That's what the institution says. You can't sustain with 30 members because you're barely paying your bills now, and you're not obviously doing too much, and you're not getting new members. And you see, all of that is the language of the institution that says if you're not matching up to our standard and our norm, that you must not be able to be church anymore. And I want to suggest, well, okay, that's the Opus Dei response. You can't be church anymore. I don't know. You see, in the parable, the last part of the parable is very, you know, in the end of the world, they're going to be separated out from you anyway. You know, it's going to be, you know, what is it, not the born again, it's the left behind people, right? You've seen those, you know, there's lots of those apocalyptic movies out there. The Left Behind says, you know, that you're going to be walking down the street with a friend, and all of a sudden that friend going up to heaven, and you're walking along. And that must mean that that friend is the saved one, and you're the condemned and damned one. Wow. I I don't know. The challenge then is that when the voice says, let it be, that it's not to say, we'll just let it in God's hands. But I want to suggest that the surprise comes that, there's a different narrative, a different scenario, a different way of considering this. And because we're so caught up in the norm that we don't hear it. We were talking about it, right? That a church that says, we love you all. You're all loved. But you're gay and you just have to stop being gay. Then we'll love you more. Oh, we accept women, but the Bible says you just can't lead and preach. Wow. That sounds like the parable, doesn't it? There's just bad people, and we're just not going to accept bad people. We're just going to let God change their hearts. Well, I don't know. How do we know? There's another way. The surprise is, and by the way, none of these books give the answer. Because the surprise is what? You all have to come to an answer. And maybe one answer, another answer, another answer. The surprise comes that when we are able to understand the reign of God in our midst, that reliance upon the vision of the reign of God might provide a different scenario and a different outcome than what we might expect or what we look for. So be surprised how we do this and what's ahead and what our future is. Be surprised. But that means we don't sit back, that we engage. That we engage and we get involved, and that we ruminate and converse and argue and have a dialogue and maybe not a dialogue, and that we do the things that we need to do in order to transform and change. Not ourselves, but to transform and change the world in which we live.